Welcome. Oh, you like frustration, huh? You like confusion, huh? You like slapping your forehead, screaming, "That doesn't make sense!" Do you? Okay. Well, you've come to the right place if you like pain. Really? Okay. Are you sure you know what you're getting yourself into? Okay. We're doing this, aren't we? Okay. Okay. Japanese submarines, then. It should come as no surprise that throughout the war, Japan was fighting an invisible enemy: cryptoanalysis, code breaking, radio interception, traffic analysis, radio triangulation, intelligence, the cipher war. There were many levels and forms of this. Obviously, the most famous was its W at the Battle of Midway and its failure at Pearl Harbor. But it didn't start or end there. Even before the war, and right up to its end, the intelligence war was critical. Volumes could and have been penned about the intelligence war. Obviously, it affected the battles in the air, on the land, and on the sea. Not as often talked about was the impact on Japanese submarines. Of course, this is just compounded by how little Japanese submarines are talked about in general. While there is much that could be talked about, I'm going to take a minute to touch on FRUMEL, Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne, and FRUPAC, Fleet Radio Unit Pacific. Among other things, they were constantly intercepting Japanese radio traffic and giving heads up on the movement of Japanese submarines. This was devastating to their submarine fleet. Where did that destroyer escort overhead come from? You guessed it, FRUMEL. It is impossible to overstate the value of the cipher war. I could go on, but we've got a lot to cover here. An issue that has to be addressed from the beginning is the types of Japanese submarines. They had somewhere between 4 and who knows general types. They had the large I-type long-range cruiser submarines that could generally be divided into with and without aircraft. In fact, of the 56 submarines worldwide over 3,000 tons during the war, 52 were Japanese, the others being Surcouf, Narwhal, Nautilus, and Argonaut. Most countries between the wars had toyed with the idea of submarines carrying aircraft for scouting, but had discarded it as impractical. Not Japan. They ran with it. Most of the time, this was a single float plane that was stored partially disassembled in a hangar, more like tubes, on one end of the sail. When the sub surfaced, it would be assembled, launched off a catapult, do its thing, land, be disassembled, and stowed. Needless to say, this was very time consuming and left the sub vulnerable on the surface. With hindsight, the return on investment was minimal, and it's easy to see why other countries abandoned the idea. The non-aircraft eyes were almost as large and had equally long range, but acted in a more conventional role. Lest you think this sounds like a grand adventure, remember, no, as in zero, Japanese submarines had air conditioning or refrigeration, and they mostly operated in the tropics. The medium row were much smaller, 1,000 tons or less, patrol boats with much shorter ranges. The small, less than 500 tons Ha boats were latecomers and very much an emergency program meant for short range work. Then there were the midget subs and Kaitens. Both were carried by mother subs. These were nasty, dirty things. The midget sub program was started pre-war and debuted at Pearl Harbor. They weren't technically suicide weapons, but in practice the chances of survival for their 2, 3, or 5-man crews were very low. The Kaitens, however, were. These were basically 24-inch Type 93 long lance torpedoes fitted with a one-man pilot cockpit deployed from the deck of a submarine or other ship. Make no mistake, once you got in it and it was launched, you didn't get out. Hit or miss, you were riding that thing into the sunset. and it was usually miss. The Chitons really only scored a few kills. The midget subs didn't do much better. I'm not going to give them their own videos. I'll just cover them as I get to the mother subs. In most cases, I look at the Chitons and I just wonder how a regular torpedo wouldn't have worked the same. Only slightly less harebrained was the use of submarines for supply runs. Pretty much every country used submarines to insert and evacuate commando teams. Submarines were also used to supply guerrillas operating behind enemy lines. Nothing new there. In Japan's case, though, this went to a new level. It's no revelation to say that, especially around Guadalcanal and New Guinea, as Allied air power grew, taking freighters in became suicidal. They tried running supplies in by destroyer, but even that was problematic. So they turned to using submarines. I don't think I have to go over how much extra room there usually is in the people part of a submarine. The idea of supplying hundreds or even thousands of troops by submarine has got to make a quartermaster cry. I suspect these were the same people that thought 600 porta potties was enough for Woodstock. Then you add in combat where those troops are going through food, ammunition, medical supplies, whatever, like beer at a frat house. Well, that didn't work, so they got more creative. Barges. Submarines towing barges. Now, remember, a sub's only real defense when attacked by a ship or aircraft is its ability to submerge. I'm not making this up. They also lashed Daihatsu landing craft to their deck. On the slightly less drunk dialing your X side of desperate, they did build or convert cargo submarines. Some were purpose-built mine layers that were fitted to carry avgas. The idea was they could meet long-range reconnaissance float planes at sea and refuel them. That sounds slightly less crazy if you remember the Canton-Kasai concept. Others could carry fuel and supplies, but really not enough. Speaking of supplies, throughout the war, Japan and Germany, along with Italy, tried running supplies to and from each other using submarines. This was in addition to the German and Italian subs that operated in the Indian Ocean and Southwest Pacific. Did the Japanese use their supply subs for these missions? Nope. Once Italy collapsed, their subs in the Pacific were taken over by the Germans. When Germany threw in the towel, their subs, along with the former Italian ones, were taken over by the Japanese and numbered in the 500 series. For the most part, they didn't and couldn't do anything with them, as they lacked the training and spare parts to maintain them. The technology transfer from Germany during the war, however, was a boon for Japan. They actually gained magnetic detonator technology, which worked about as well as it did for the US, UK, or Germany. They got designs for more powerful aircraft engines. They got blueprints for the V-1 cruise missile, which they used to make the Oka. They got blueprints for the Me-163 and the Me-262 rocket and jet fighters. They got blueprints for German sonar, which they used to upgrade their own types, that were very much inferior to Western types. They got the designs for German submarines, including the types 21 and 23. Snorkels was another idea they inherited from the Germans. Their welding industry advanced considerably. They got blueprints for the superior German tanks, which helped them design better armor. Radar and radar detectors was another field they got help from Germany in. And the list goes on. Probably most disturbingly was the radiological technology. Like Germany, they weren't close to building an atomic bomb, but the threat of them using balloons to deliver radioactive dirty bombs to the continental U.S. was very real. With the wide variety of submarines, organizing them can be confusing. Do you do it by type? By laying down or starting? What about commissioning? Maybe by when they were ordered? It can be nerve-wracking. For simplicity, I'm just going to arrange them all in order by when the first of each class was started. Along that path, it has to be remembered there is a difference between when a ship or sub is commissioned versus when it is in service. Usually, once a ship or sub is commissioned, it isn't immediately ready to go. Months usually have to be spent testing and practicing as the crew gels together, figures things out, and practices. Probably nowhere is this more important than on a ship that deliberately sinks itself over and over and over, often while being shot at. As you listen to the videos, pay attention to how many subs are lost to diving accidents. It just takes one person messing up to usually doom everyone and remove that asset. To that end, while I have listed the completion dates for all subs on the subs completed after the start of the Pacific War, at the start of their histories, I start with when they entered service. If you're interested, compare the two. Continuing on with the topic of dates, I know this is going to frustrate some purists, but hear me out. Get comfy, in fact. I seriously considered doing a detailed record of each of their activities, each one of them. Make it as complete as possible. That is to say, for example, on June 27, 1942, she left truck and arrived at Leh on June 29th at 8:05 p.m. I even wrote a lot of them. The problem was editing, specifically, in this case, pacing. As anyone that produces a thing, let's say movies, will tell you, a production can grow or die in editing. Since my goal here is to tell the tale of this usually overlooked force in an audible way, that means it has to be coherent in that form. Once I started listening to what I had written, I realized it was technically fine, but virtually incoherent. Just so many dates and times were thrown in, it killed the pacing. So reluctantly and frustratingly, I had to go back and do some brutal editing, just so it could flow better. I've left most of the big dates in, but smaller things had to go. For that same reason, I actually originally tried to put in as many of the ships they sunk as possible. I did this to try to dispel the myth that they were Keystone cops running around and never catching anything. No, they didn't achieve the success rates of German or American subs, but let's be honest, they were mostly saddled with an operational doctrine of fleet actions rather than commerce rating. Also, I'm sure I'm going to get hate for this, but they were also technically inferior. You can hate me for saying that, but go look it up for yourself. Compare the quality of American, British, or German radar, for example, to Japanese radar. It's not that they were stupid or anything like that. They simply didn't have the industrial base. They did the best they could with what they had. Later, when they started incorporating German technology, they did better. By then, though, it was too little and too late. If anyone is still listening, let me get back to the sinkings and damagings. So as I was editing, I realized it was killing the pace. All right, she sunk a ship. Wait, where were we? What day was it? What month? I had to cut it down to keep it flowing. Along with that, I thought about integrating the service histories of the boats in their various classes. For the smaller classes, it worked out okay. The larger classes are ones where their service lives weren't short, however. Again, looked good when reading it, but when listening to it, no bueno. So the axe fell again, and more editing. I also thought about putting the starting and completion dates with the individual subs. That would have helped make the story of each sub a self-contained story. It also would have spoken to commissioning versus in-service time. Ultimately, I decided to keep those dates separate to help give a picture of when they were started and completed compared to each other in their class. Entered service times will have to do for getting a feel for when a sub's career started. On the other side of that is, of course, when its career ended. All I can say is, ouch. If you thought it was hazardous to be an American submariner with their defective torpedoes or a German submariner, oh boy. And this partially goes back to the intelligence thing. If American submariners got hazardous duty pay, Japanese submariners should have gotten nearly suicidal pay. Their loss rate was honestly horrendous. Operationally, they tended to deploy in long patrol lines that weren't mutually supportive. This led to things like the USS England rolling up a patrol line, knocking off one RO boat after another. And then there was the technology gap. Sonar-wise, while most American, British, and German passive sonar was good for up to 3 miles, on a good day, Japanese sonar was lucky to hear out to 1.5 miles. That doesn't even touch on mechanical angle solver computers like the US's Mark III TDC. Of course, this is almost irrelevant compared to radar. But they're submarines, you say. Yes, true. But you have to remember, in these days, submarines spent most of their time on the surface, especially if you're towing barges. Most Japanese submarines that were sunk were initially detected by radar, whether it be aircraft, surface ships, or even American submarines. It's actually remarkable how many Japanese submarines were sunk by American submarines. You have to remember this was a time, mostly, before homing torpedoes, so submarine-on-submarine combat was pretty rare. It was still a small amount, but considering the obstacles, it happened more than you might think. And American radar played a big part of that, especially in the pre-dawn or post-sunset hours. When a U.S. ship got a Japanese submarine, usually it was radar that initially detected them. A lot of the time, despite popular perception, the killing blow didn't come from depth charges, but rather from Hedgehog. That means destroyer escorts. Aircraft-wise, again, the initial contact was usually made with radar. This was followed by a barrage of depth charges and bombs. Later in the war, the ancestors of modern ASW tools like sonobuoys and homing torpedoes were used. I do want to add that despite popular perception, as in the Atlantic, the goal wasn't to have depth charges explode alongside an enemy submarine, but rather under it. That way, much like a mine, the rising pressure bubble would snap the sub in half. That makes it much more of a trick shot. Japanese radar, on the other hand, was appalling. As with the surface fleet, it was late to the game, only trickled into service, was chronically unreliable, and didn't have the range or fidelity of Allied radar. Compounding that was the general lack of radar tactics. One advantage Japanese submarines had over their U.S. counterparts was their torpedoes. Those worked just fine, mostly. They did have their share of deep runs and prematures, but nothing like the thrice-cursed Mark XIV. The primary Japanese submarine torpedo was the Type 95. Design work began in 1935, and it entered service in 1938. This was basically a 533mm version of the famous Type 93 long lance for submarines. Length was 7.15 meters. Warhead size was 405 kilograms, and it used a simple plunger-type detonator. Like its larger cousins, it burned kerosene for fuel and used oxygen as an oxidizer. This meant its bubble trail was much smaller, if visible at all. It also gave it very respectable speed-range combinations. At its most efficient speed of 46 knots, it could do 12,000 meters. At its top speed of 51 knots, it could still go 9,000 meters. Another, less appreciable advantage-ish many of the larger Japanese submarines had was their deck gun. Several carried a 140 millimeter deck gun, or two of them. This was larger than most submarines, which gave them a heavier punch. The downside was, of course, they had to be hand-loaded, and any attempt to use them against most surface ships would be near suicidal. To again address this, I'm mostly going to be using metric measurements. Why? Not because it's the most common measurement system in the world, per se. Not because it is the system most engineers and scientists use, per se. The reason directly is because when they were building them, the engineers were thinking metric. That is to say, if you asked a Japanese engineer what size this torpedo is, they would have said 533 millimeters or 53.3 centimeters, not 21 inch. They're pretty much the same thing, but you get the idea. Sorry, my fellow Americans, but even here in the US of A, engineers and scientists use metric almost exclusively. If you don't believe me, ask Siri or Alexa when General Motors switched to metric. Yeah, that hose clamp you have, it's not 9/16, it's 14 millimeter. I know, boo boo on you, sir. Get over it. Operationally, there are a few things I want to touch on. One is bases. As with their surface ships, Japanese submarines' main base and the heart of their industry was naturally Japan. They were built there, and all heavy work had to be done there. The Japanese Empire simply didn't have the economy or time to set up deep repair facilities outside Japan. It grew to an impressive size very quickly in early 1942, but realistically, it didn't last long enough for industry to move in, even if it had the capacity to do so, which it didn't. This meant they had to make do with forward ports that were capable of resupply and minor repairs. The main ones were Kwajalein in the Marshalls, Rabaul, Truk in the Carolinas, Sabang on Sumatra, Singapore, Formosa, now Taiwan, and Paramushiro up north. By the way, that's why the U.S.'s early 1942 carrier raids were launched against the Gilberts and Marshalls. Yes, for morale and experience, but mostly because they were afraid the Japanese would use those bases to launch an invasion of Hawaii. The second thing I want to cover was the Japanese sinking of Soviet ships. Well, yeah, duh, Axis allies. Not so fast. You have to remember that until August 1945, Japan and the Soviet Union were technically not at war. This followed the 1939 peace treaty they signed. It was for this reason Soviet-flagged ships were able to run supplies from the U.S. West Coast past Japan to the Soviet Far East. So yeah, this was actually kind of a big deal. If the Soviet Union hadn't already been kind of busy, this could have led to a declaration of war. It didn't happen a lot, but it did happen. Finally, let's talk about one of my favorite lost topics, the submarine campaign off the U.S. West Coast. Before, during, and after the raid on Pearl Harbor, there were a lot of Japanese submarines patrolling the Hawaiian waters. In fact, there were probably more Japanese submarines in the area than American. Later in December, several moved to patrol off the U.S.'s west coast where, with only a few subs, they managed a pretty respectable tally. Please note, this was a month before German U-boats began operating off the east coast. So next time someone gripes about the U-boats, ask them about the Japanese boats off the west coast. They didn't stay long, and only occasionally one or two returned, but it did happen and caused a short panic not only among the population, but also among the leadership. While much ink has been spilled about Operation Drumbeat, it's virtually forgotten. Why? Well, part of it is undoubtedly Barbara Tuchman's law that the more something is reported, the worse it is. And let's be honest, the activities of the Japanese submarine force doesn't get the coverage of the German submarine arm. I probably wouldn't be doing this if it did, but why not? Why isn't the Japanese submarine force as well storied? Well, I'm going to have to dive into some speculation to give you my opinion, and that's what speculation is. Feel free to disagree with me. Also, these aren't in any particular order of importance. Finally, some of these speculations may be interpreted as conspiratorial. Feel free to vent your anger below. I promise I'll read every rant. Wink, wink. One reason I suspect the Japanese submarine force doesn't get a lot of attention is because, admittedly, they weren't as effective as they could have been. Sorry. They definitely didn't get the kill ratios of the German subs racked up. This was despite their subs being completely functional, if not innovative, but functional. We could get into why, but honestly, I've gone on long enough and I haven't even got to the submarines yet. Another reason, I believe, was during the war, there was a deliberate effort to play up the threat of Germany and downplay the threat of Japan to the U.S. population. This was part of the Germany First policy and the need to sell that policy to the American people. In non-interventionist America, and there's a difference between isolationist and non-interventionist, everyone knew why we were at war with Japan. Pearl Harbor, that's all you had to say. War with Germany and Italy? That was a harder sell. Yes, Hitler did declare war on the U.S., but in fact, almost forgotten is that many Americans weren't feeling it. Little has been said about the near mass desertion the U.S. Army almost faced in mid-1942. See, bet this is new to you also. I was shocked. The gist is, many of those guys that signed up to avenge Pearl Harbor were suddenly being told they were being sent to fight in North Africa. That's why you see the Why We Fight series coming out. So let's not talk about the Japanese subs off California and focus on the German subs off Cape Hatteras. Another issue is, post-war, the pivot was to the Atlantic, NATO, and the Cold War. As part of that was the very questionable attempt to rehabilitate the German military. It was all those SS guys. The professional military folks were tough, honorable, and competent. You can confidently stand side by side with them against the rotten commies, yada yada yada. Another reason, I believe, was cultural. For those that don't remember, before the movie Saving Private Ryan came out in 1998, serious interest in the U.S. was mostly confined to academia. There was far more interest among the general public in the Vietnam War, mostly the social, moral, and political ramifications thereof more than the operational realities. This, I believe, was partially because for the U.S., World War II only lasted about 4 years and started unparalleled economic growth. The continental U.S. was barely affected by the war. And to be honest, only a relatively small percent of the population saw action. The U.S. only barely had a double-digit percentage of its population mobilized at its peak. I'll also throw in that even to this day, most Americans remain non-interventionist. Now, let's compare that to that other English-speaking nation, England. England, as a nation, was on the front line for 6 years. The Blitz, Coventry, Keep Calm and Carry On, etc. Also, because it had a smaller population, a larger percent saw action, not counting the air raid shelters and threat of invasion. It also marked the start of the economic decline and collapse of the British Empire. Social welfare superseded the military in public importance. That's why Churchill lost in 1945. Because of that trauma, World War II never lost prominence in Britain like it did in the US. As a result, most of the literary work about World War II has been done by the British. Now, I'm not talking propaganda here. Let me be clear about that. I'm talking about perspective. There is a saying that if history was written by cats, it would mostly be about cats. So the Japanese submarine activities in the Pacific, and specifically off the U.S. West Coast, not extensively covered. In terms of Japanese sources, first you have a language barrier. Secondly, you have a social barrier. For some odd reason, Japan doesn't like to talk about the realities of World War II. I can't imagine why. Again, those are just my opinions. Feel free to disagree. Anyway, enough administration. Let's finally get to the subs. The oldest Japanese submarines to see active service in World War II, at least for a little while, were the 9 boats of the 996-ton surfaced and 1,322 tons submerged displacement Row 60 class, which were started in late 1921, sometimes known as the L4 type. Based on a British design but built locally, these were good boats for their time and size. It's just that their time was the 1920s and this was the 1940s. As a result, by the time the war started, they were pretty tired. By late 1942, the survivors were pulled off the front lines and relegated to training. Row 60 was started December 5, 1921, and completed September 17, 1923. Row 61 was started June 5, 1922, and completed February 9, 1924. Row 62 was started September 8, 1922, and completed July 24, 1924. Row 63 was started April 2, 1923, and completed December 20, 1924. Row 64 was started October 15, 1923, and completed April 30, 1925. Row 65 was started November 15, 1924, and completed June 30, 1926. Row 66 was started December 1, 1925, and completed July 28, 1927. Row 67 was started March 5, 1925, and completed December 15, 1926. Row 68 was started February 6, 1924, and completed October 29, 1925. Main armament was 6 forward-facing 533mm torpedo tubes, with the top and middle 4 each having a single reload. A single open 76mm deck gun was mounted forward of the sail. Propulsion on the surface was provided by 2 diesel engines, which produced 2,400 horsepower that ran the 2 propellers and recharged the batteries for a surface speed of 16 knots. While submerged, they used their batteries to power 2 motors, which produced 1,600 horsepower for a top speed of 8 knots. Range on the surface was 5,500 nautical miles at 10 knots, and submerged they could do 85 nautical miles at 4 knots. Test diving depth was 60 meters. Row 60 started the war on standby at Kwajalein. In late December, she helped cover the second invasion of Wake, where she was strafed and bombed by one of the few remaining Wildcats. Badly damaged, she made her way back to Kwajalein on the surface, but as she approached Kwajalein in the pre-dawn hours of December 29, 1941, she ran hard aground, cracking her hull, and had to be abandoned. Later, her hulk was strafed again, which detonated her torpedoes, blowing her up. Her wreck is still there. Row 61 started the war on standby at Kwajalein. In late December, she helped cover the second invasion of Wake, then returned to Kwajalein at the end of the month. She was still there on February 1, 1942, guarding the marshals when aircraft from Enterprise raided the harbor, but wasn't damaged, so set out to find the carrier. Coming up short, she returned to port. In early March, she made her way back to Japan for an overhaul via Truk and Saipan, arriving in late March. In late July, she headed to the Aleutians to patrol there in case the Americans started a counteroffensive there following the Battle of Midway. Near Atka Island on August 31st, 1942, she was spotted by a PBY which strafed and bombed her, damaging her. Soon, another PBY came in with more depth charges. Then the destroyer Reed showed up with more depth charges, which brought her to the surface where she was finished off with 5-inch gunfire. Rose 62 started the war on standby at Kwajalein. In late December, she helped cover the second invasion of Wake, accidentally ramming and sinking Rose 66 on the way, then returned to Kwajalein at the end of the month. She was still there on February 1st, 1942, guarding the marshals, when aircraft from Enterprise raided the harbor but wasn't damaged, so set out to find the carrier. Coming up short, she returned to port. In early March, she made her way back to Japan for an overhaul via Truk and Saipan, arriving in late March. In late July, she headed to the Aleutians to patrol there in case the Americans started a counteroffensive there following the Battle of Midway. In late October, she returned to Japan and was relegated to training for the rest of the war. Post-war, she was scuttled. Rose 63 started the war at Kwajalein patrolling the marshals. In January 1942, she reconnoitered the soon-to-be invaded Rabaul before returning to the marshals at the end of the month. While in the marshals, in late February, her rudder broke down, forcing her back to Japan via Truk and Saipan, arriving in late March. With repairs and refit completed in late July, she headed to the Aleutians to patrol there in case the Americans started a counteroffensive following the Battle of Midway. In early October, she returned to Japan and was relegated to training for the rest of the war. Post-war, she was scuttled. Rose 64 started the war at Kwajalein patrolling the marshals. In the later half of the month, she supported the second invasion of Wake and then returned to Kwajalein. In January 1942, she reconnoitered the soon-to-be invaded Rabaul before returning to the marshals at the end of the month. In late March, she returned to Japan via Truk and Saipan, arriving in early April. With her refit completed in late July, she headed to the Aleutians to patrol there in case the Americans started a counteroffensive following the Battle of Midway. In early October, she returned to Japan and was relegated to training for the rest of the war. In Hiroshima Bay on April 12, 1945, she hit a mine and sunk. Rose 65 started the war patrolling around Wake, but when the first invasion failed miserably, she returned to Kwajalein in the middle of the month and patrolled the marshals until mid-February 1942, when she sailed to support the invasion of Rabaul at the end of the month. In February, she patrolled the Gilberts, and then in March returned to Japan via Saipan, arriving in early April. With her overhaul completed in early October, she sailed to patrol the Aleutians. She was at Kiska on November 3rd, 1942, when a bomber raid hit the island. In an attempt to escape the raid, she dived before her main induction valve, which feeds air to the engines, could be sealed. While the flooded stern hit the bottom, the crew of the forward two-third were able to escape through the torpedo tubes, but eventually the whole thing sunk. Rose 66 started the war patrolling near Wake. South of Wake, in a rain squall, on the evening of December 17, 1941, she was accidentally rammed and sunk by Rose 62. Rose 67 started the war patrolling around Wake, but returned to Kwajalein in the middle of the month. In January 1942, she patrolled around Cape St. George in support of the invasion of Rabaul. In February and the first half of March, she patrolled the Gilberts and then returned to Japan via the Marianas, arriving in early April. With her refit completed in early September, she headed to patrol the Aleutians. On September 26th, she arrived at the port of Kiska, which was promptly hit by an American air raid. Damaging her badly enough, she had to return to Japan for repairs, arriving in mid-October. Afterward, she was relegated to training in home waters for the rest of the war. Post-war, she was scrapped. Rose 68 started the war patrolling the Marshall Islands. In the second half of December, she covered the second invasion of Wake. In January, she patrolled around the Solomons to support the invasion of Rabaul. In February and March, she returned to patrolling the Marshalls, then headed to Japan for a refit. With the refit completed in late July, she sailed to patrol the Aleutians until late September, when she returned to Japan and was relegated to training for the rest of the war. Post-war, she was scuttled.